online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. 'Tis the Lenten season, so what better time than to review this new biography on Francis Cardinal George.
And we'll get to what you gave up for Lent later.
We will. Michael Heinlein is the editor of Simply Catholic and the author of the new book, Glorifying Christ, The Life of Cardinal Francis E. George, which is available March 6th, but I'm sure you can pre-order in all the appropriate places. Michael Heinlein, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Simply Catholic. That's a phrase that Cardinal George liked to use, too. What does it mean?
It means that we must get beyond the labels of left and right and get at the heart of true and false, which is really the story of Christ, isn't it?
It is, and so Cardinal George was known, even outside of Catholic circles, as being a prodigious intellect. But tell us something about him as a simple Catholic.
Well, Cardinal George was someone who was committed to being a disciple of Jesus Christ, and so he wasn't caught up in any of the worldly concerns that sometimes plague bishops or other Catholics. He was only concerned about God's truth and how we are to proclaim that to a world that, particularly in his mind, our own world, needs it so much.
But he also had to operate in the real world, and he had to deal with real problems within the church, including the sex abuse scandal. He was criticized for how he handled what he was in charge of handling as it pertains to the sex abuse scandal. How would you review his performance on that matter?
Well, there was a lot of untold about the story of Cardinal George in handling the sex abuse crisis. What we know was particularly told with a unique perspective, perhaps an agenda. Cardinal George was never someone who wanted to talk a lot about himself. But what I have told in the book, and I hope that people pay attention to, is that Cardinal George was one of perhaps the strongest advocate for zero tolerance in the face of abusive clergy. And he had to fight, even in the halls of the Vatican, to get that codified in law. Because even Rome, back in the early 2000s, was a little hesitant to make zero tolerance a permanent thing. But Cardinal George was there to advocate for that. And there were times, of course, the well-known story of Daniel McCormick and his case in Chicago, which was horrendous and was a real albatross around the Cardinal's neck until he died. He admitted that there were failures on the part of the Archdiocese. He himself took the blame since he was at the top. He never tried to cover up anything. He never tried to, make excuses. But at the end of the day, Cardinal George also was willing and able to enact reform and invited a former FBI officer to come into the chancery to look at those systems of how the Archdiocese handled abuse allegations. And really, he left the Archdiocese much stronger in that sense.
When you think about his time at the Arch and the time since his passing under Cardinal Cupich, how would you compare and contrast what the Archdiocese of Chicago is today under Cupich as it was under George?
Well, the comparisons and contrasting of Bernardine and George was something that also came up in the media back in 1997 when Cardinal George was appointed to Chicago. And when he was asked that question at his announcement of being Archbishop, he said that Cardinal Bernardine was a Southern gentleman, but he said, "I'm a Chicagoan." So he certainly made his own way and proved to be his own man. I certainly think that Cardinal Cupich has proved to be his own man too. And I think that the history books will evaluate Cardinal Cupich's tenure in Chicago on its own terms. I think that Cardinal George's priorities, some of them are Cardinal Cupich's priorities too, but Cardinal George had a different approach, and he was a missionary. He was a university professor. He was a scholar. He was someone who was very much connected to the people. And so whatever, can be drawn or not between the two of them, I think, their whole purpose in life is to proclaim the gospel. And so we hope that, the people will certainly still be able to practice the faith under either of them.
But would you agree that Cardinal Francis George wasn't political by any means? Because I feel Cardinal Cupich is.
Well, Cardinal George was allergic to being political. Cardinal George, again, when he was appointed to Chicago in '97, was asked if he was liberal or conservative.
Yeah, I remember.
And he said, "I'm neither." He said, "Catholicism is about true and false." And so Cardinal George's whole approach to dealing with moral issues in society was to proclaim the gospel truth, to call out politicians, when they are fracturing society because of their lack of understanding of God's law. But he was never one to meddle in political circumstances, and he was even, perhaps you would say, someone who tried to stay away from it. He didn't even like to have his picture taken with politicians if he could avoid it.
What about vision, as it comes to, again, the operation of the archdiocese? I mean, you have to be an executive, too, in that position. Obviously rely on people with financial expertise, for example, but still, you're the executive, you're the head of the archdiocese. And so his vision for dealing with the financial challenges that the arch faced, in particular because of the litigation associated with the sex abuse scandal, but not limited to that, Catholic schools that were struggling financially and so on and so forth. Sort of his vision for the arch as an institution in Chicago, Catholic schools as an institution in Chicago. Can you give us some insight there?
Cardinal George would be the first to say that he wasn't always the best at administration because he had a different set of parameters through which he viewed his ministry as a bishop. So he would often quip, when I meet St. Peter at the gates, I won't have to answer how much money is in the checking account. I'll have to answer how many souls I saved. He was always very reticent to close institutions, although certainly he did quite a bit. He even closed the church where he himself was baptized. He was very, very hesitant to close schools because he said when you close a school, you close the child's entire world. And so he had a sense of providence about him that as long as you're doing what Christ asked of us, then the money will follow, and the circumstances in which we find ourselves needing the resources to proclaim the gospel, God will take care of us. He had a real sense of providence that doesn't necessarily match up with the qualities we look at in administration.
One of the things I was critical of Cardinal George, one of the few things I was critical of Cardinal George about was his handling of Father Michael Pfleger, and maybe that's because I'm political and he wasn't, but my view and the view of a lot of Catholics is that Pfleger is an embarrassment to the church, and there seemed to be special rules for Pfleger that were not governing other priests, or that didn't govern him, that did govern other priests, probably a better way to put it. And there was clearly some tension between the two, and he disciplined him on at least one occasion that I can remember. But many people, myself included, wanted him to go further. How did he view someone like Michael Pfleger, and how would you assess the way that he handled someone who was rogue like that individual?
Cardinal George often said of himself that he was sometimes hesitant to make decisions, sometimes desultory. I think that the Pfleger situation certainly exhibited that to a certain degree. But what was it that he was hesitant about in kind of cracking down on Father Pfleger, as some might have wanted? I think that Cardinal George's main concern there was that he did not want Saint Sabina to break off from the Catholic Church, because he was very much concerned about unity in the Church, salvation of souls. And for as many problems as people might be able to identify with the way that the faith is lived out at Saint Sabina, Cardinal George knew that at the end of the day they were Catholic, and that he didn't want the people of the parish to be driven away from the Catholic Church. But as you say, he did discipline Father Pfleger. He actually suspended him twice from ministry because of his, once because of political engagement that crossed the boundary in the cardinal's mind, and then second time because he was threatening to leave the church after asked to be reassigned. And Cardinal George was very clear that a priest who is ministering in the church needs to be of the mind of the church. And so that's why he took those actions. But yes, many people were definitely unsatisfied with that stance. And I think in the end, the cardinal was still a man. He was a human being. He was someone who found himself very frustrated with Father Pfleger. Father Pfleger himself told me that. But Cardinal George also respected the good work that Pfleger was doing in the area there, particularly, the works of social ministry of the church. And so he really felt that cutting him off from the church was going to somehow leave the church less performative, less able to carry out the work of Christ.
One of Cardinal George's more bold and thought-provoking, hotly debated statements was the following: I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison. His successor will die a martyr in the public square. And his successor will pick up the shards of a ruined society and slowly help rebuild civilization, as the church has done so often in human history. I'd be interested in your interpretation, your understanding of what Cardinal George is trying to communicate there, because it sounds like if his successor is going to die in prison and his successor after that will die as a martyr in the public square, we're in for some rough times ahead.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. Just a bit of background about that. He was asked that question at a gathering of priests in Louisiana in the days when the church was really being persecuted under the Obama administration in regard to the HHS mandate. And the question was asked, what's the worst that could happen? And so this cardinal gave this kind of thought project for us to think about. What is the worst that could happen? And he was just repeating, really, what's happened in society in the last 2 millennia of Christianity, that these things are not things that have not happened before. And so there's that. Now, he can also be looked at as a bit prophetic, although he bristled at being called a prophet. But he was kind of warning us in many other ways, not just with this quote, about the ways in which our society was abandoning the laws of God, and that only bad things can come from that. So he was, in a sense, warning us that we're in for a bumpy ride. But the most important part of that quote, I think, as the cardinal himself reiterated several times, is that it ends in hope, that the church will pick up the shards of a broken society and bring healing, because only the church is capable of doing that. So ultimately, Cardinal George was a man of hope that knew, yes, there is the cross, yes, there is Good Friday, but there's also Easter Sunday.
He is Michael Heinlein. He's the editor of Simply Catholic and author of the new book, Glorifying Christ, The Life of Cardinal Francis E. George, which, again, available March 6th, but, queue up and order now. Michael Heinlein, thanks so much for joining us. Good luck with the book. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
Listen to podcasts of Dan and Amy from the AM 560 mobile app. Download it today at 560theanswer.com/mobile.
As an American business owner, you know basic supplies you use for your business can run out quickly, and you've got to get more in a hurry. Now, there's supplyland.com. Based close by in Wheeling, Illinois, Supplyland is your new online destination for essential packaging, janitorial, safety, and maintenance supplies. A great selection of the most widely used products with over 2,000 trusted brand items to choose from. Most made right here in America. Running your business efficiently requires supplies. It's time to stock up at supplyland.com before you run low. Choose supplyland.com, a proud supporter of what you believe in, the American dream and conservative values. Get free shipping on qualifying orders of $150 or more and next day delivery on any order to Chicagoland businesses. Plus, use promo code AM560 at checkout and you'll get a free Super Soft Supplyland blanket. That's promo code AM560. Supplyland.com. It's in the box. Supplyland.com is a proud supporter of Food for the Poor and AM560 The Answer.
In the new